Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Today I am joined by Dr. David Beito. He is a former History Professor Emeritus at the University of Alabama and received his Ph.D. in History from the University of Wisconsin in 1986. Dr. Beito, thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks for asking me. I'm looking forward to it.
Why is studying history important?
Well, I mean, it depends on what your goals are. I can tell you why it was important to me, because everybody's got to answer that question individually. And I have colleagues that come in at it from all sorts of different angles. I tried a lot of different career possibilities. I tried journalism. I tried. I thought of going into the movie production in some sort. I thought of business, but I settled on history because there were all these issues. I was, very much inclined into libertarian direction that I thought that history could address, that I didn't see necessarily being fully addressed by a lot of people interested in the history of markets and the history of mutual aid and the history of voluntary cooperation. Because we have real life examples of the success of all of these things: markets, mutual aid, private provision of services. We have historical examples, and I wanted to study those. So that was one issue I was interested in, certainly. I think American history is a little bit class-oriented in the sense of you've got labor history, you've got gender studies, you got all these categories, but very often missing from that is the conflict between the individual and the state, and the role of markets and voluntary institutions in solving social problems. That was always a motivator for me.
And how did you become a libertarian?
I think it was sort of a gradual process. My parents were Hubert Humphrey Democrats, very much New Dealer types. And I sort of became interested in conservatism for a while, but then became disillusioned with that because of the Vietnam War, among other reasons, and wage and price controls, and moved gradually in a more libertarian direction. A big book that influenced me, influenced very few people, I think, compared to me, was a book called It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand. And it was written by Jerome Tuccilli. It was a rather thin book. I guess it was in the late 60s. And what Tuccilli talked about was his involvement with objectivism, with the Ayn Rand movement, and how he sort of ended up going into that. He was a Goldwater conservative. He toyed with he was involved in the New Left, but he sort of came at Rand from a kind of friendly, critical perspective, kind of made fun of her and, the sort of the pretensions of the objectivists and the lack of humility and so forth. But it was a sympathetic treatment. But he introduced me to all these people that, we're familiar with, libertarians are familiar with, like Murray Rothbard was a character in that, and so forth. It's a fun book. It's an irreverent book, and it's a good way to be introduced to political perspective, because Tuccilli was able to look at the critical side of some of these figures, and he didn't deify them. So I enjoyed it. It was a fun book. And it just so happened to be in my high school library. I was searching on the shelf and came across it and said, "What's this?" And I don't think I'd even read Rand at that point. It was later that I read Rand. So I read her with more of a critical eye than some people who were introduced to her.
You wrote a book titled Black Maverick, Trm Howard's Fight for Civil Rights and Economic Power. Who is Trm Howard?
Well, we could take several hours on Trm Howard. He was a guy that I just sort of discovered by chance when I was I forgot how I discovered him exactly. Oh, I can tell you exactly. Again, keying out on my interest of mutual aid. And I found that there was this all-black town in Mississippi called Mound Bayou, which was founded by a former slave of the brother of the Confederacy. His name was Joseph Davis. And this guy founded this self-help community based on as a haven for markets and freedom and voting, self-government. And it was really the only place in the Mississippi Delta of any significance where African Americans could vote, hold office. They were mayor and so forth. Anyway, they were the scene where there was a hospital. It was a hospital run by a fraternal organization, a mutual aid organization, no government money at all. They charged something like $7 for 30 days of hospital care in the 1940s, which, even if you take out your inflation calculator, is quite a bargain. And they provided the full gamut of healthcare services and did it in a high quality way. Most of the people that were members of this group and therefore had the hospital insurance were the poorest of the poor, were in terms of today, in terms of then, sharecroppers, farm tenants, that kind of thing, mostly women. And it was a very successful mutual aid organization. Well, anyway, their chief surgeon was this guy, Dr. Trm Howard. And I kept being prodded by people there in the town who said, "You got to write about him." And I kind of went, "Yeah, whatever." And it turns out that Dr. Howard was a dynamo of Black business success. He was one of the wealthiest self-made Black people in the South. He had a home construction firm. He had a insurance company. He built a restaurant with a beer garden. He was a showman. He was kind of the P.T. Barnum of civil rights. But then he branched off and used all of this as a foundation for a very successful civil rights movement. In Mississippi, a mass movement. He was also very much into things libertarians would like. He was a gun owner. He had a whole arsenal of weapons, including a Thompson submachine gun, and very much believed in the right of self-defense. He was a defender of property, acquiring property, business, and he was a civil rights leader, pushing very radical agenda of voting rights, going after segregation. This is all before Rosa Parks. Led a successful boycott of service stations which refused to provide restrooms for Black people. All this before the Montgomery bus boycott, under, not to diminish the achievement of the boycott, but under much, much more hostile conditions. You had whole counties in the Mississippi Delta where not a single Black person could vote. It was the worst of the worst in terms of Jim Crow. And he is working in that kind of atmosphere very effectively. And he's involved in a case that's gotten a lot of attention, the Emmett Till case. Dr. Howard, without Howard, we probably wouldn't have heard of that case. And Emmett Till's mother came to Mississippi, stayed with him during the trial of her son's killers. And there's a series on now called Women of the Movement, which depicts this and actually has a Dr. Howard in it. We hope to get a full-scale movie or miniseries focused on Howard or the town of Mound Bayou eventually, but this goes a long way to remedying, the lack of attention. So nobody's heard of him, but he was very well known at the time.
What is the evidence you have that Trm Howard influenced Rosa Parks?
Well, that evidence is a little, you could dispute it, but it's pretty strong, I think. All right. November 27th, 1955. Howard is on a speaking tour to publicize the Emmett Till case. It is the first big event for African Americans after that case in Montgomery. One of his stops is in Montgomery, Alabama. It's a relatively obscure stop. His host for that event is a nationally unknown young minister in his 20s, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks, who's an activist, is in the audience. And one of his topics in this speech, which gets over 1,000 people, which is a pretty big deal, overflow crowd at King's Church, and I think he gives another speech there too. It's about the Emmett Till case. She said it was 4 days later, that was still headline news in the Black newspapers in Montgomery. She was on a Montgomery bus and refused to give up her seat. She was asked later, "What were you thinking about?" And she said, "I was thinking about Emmett Till." And again, this had been the big event that had occurred right before that. And again, he provided a model for King as well of a successful boycott, which had taken place several years before this. We can even So again, you could say, well, gee, maybe he wasn't a direct influence and whatever, but I think she was there in the audience and heard him 4 days earlier talk about this case. But if you want to get even more direct influences, Medgar Evers, the civil rights leader, who was assassinated in 1963, Evers got his first job working for Dr. Howard. Howard brought him into the civil rights movement. Evers' wife, who's still around now and was a head of the NAACP for a while, she worked for Dr. Howard till he delivered her first two children. So we have that very much direct influence. And I think if you were to get Myrlie Evers, her name is now, she'd say, oh yeah, he was a mentor to Dr. Howard, a civil rights mentor and a business mentor. Interestingly enough, Medgar Evers is very good at insurance salesman. That side of the history of civil rights is not, people don't pay attention to it. And he sold insurance on these plantations for Dr. Howard, who had an insurance company, but he also sold civil rights with Dr. Howard's full knowledge and encouragement.
I'd like to get more into the boycotts that were successful. You mentioned something about gas stations.
Yeah, in Mississippi, much of the South, you had gas stations, and they'd be happy to take the money of African American customers. But if they wanted to use the restroom, a lot of them would just say, "Well, we don't have restrooms for colored people." And so this was a big opportunity for Howard's movement called the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. And they printed up, I think it was like 20,000 bumper stickers. People put these on their cars saying, with the slogan, "Don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom." And I talked to people and they would, they'd say, "I pulled in that gas station." I'd ask them, "Do you have a restroom for colored people?" And they'd say no. And I'd say, "Take that, gas out of my tank," and they'd drive off. And there were African Americans who owned gas stations. They would get a lot of this patronage and people would just boycott. It became so severe that a lot of the national chains, Texaco and all that, were started to put pressure. And they said, you provide, now again, this is integration, but they said you must provide restrooms for African Americans. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's not integration. Well, King's initial demand in the Montgomery bus boycott was not integration. It was African Americans would enter the bus from the rear, whites from the front, and they would be in the middle. And no one would have to give up their seat. So this is quite radical. Medgar Evers was involved in this, and it was, by all accounts, successful. And a lot of whites in Mississippi, this is before the Brown decision, so they're not quite all like up in arms, quite. And a lot of them, even the segregationists, are willing to say, well, maybe that's, I see he might have a point here. But he pulls it off. He also does a campaign against the Mississippi State Highway Patrol, which abused Black motorists. And he confronted them and he said, "Your badge is not a badge of tyranny." This is in Mississippi, where white supremacy is not, you talk about code words and debates about code. There's no code words. You have politicians saying, "We believe in white supremacy, period." We don't want Black people voting. We don't want them going to school. And here this guy comes along and he's making these inflammatory statements, very inflammatory, and gets away with it somehow.
My original understanding of the civil rights historical narrative was that you did not have really any Black achievement until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What else does that narrative leave out?
Well, that narrative is certainly wrong on that, because Howard was wealthy. There was a whole Black middle class,
And I'm
business
sorry,
class.
what years are we talking about
Oh,
generally?
1940s, 1950s. And this was inspired by Booker T. Washington to a great extent, who pushed for self-help, buying land, opening businesses, and there was a whole Black middle class out there. And really, made the civil rights movement possible. Now, what's interesting about Mississippi is the people that led that movement there were small business people. So the church, we often identify the civil rights movement with the church, Reverend Martin Luther King. And that's certainly true a lot of places. He's very religious Christian movement, Christian ministers. Not so much in Mississippi, not irreligious, but led by entrepreneurs, business people. And that and why are they able, why is that true? Because they're small, independent operators to a great extent. So whites would get these groups together and they would say, don't loan any money to them, the citizens' councils, boycott them. They did this kind of economic pressure on Black people, civil rights figures. But what happens in Mississippi is they're able to resist that for two reasons. One is a lot of these guys are, they got their own businesses, they got a Black clientele. Another reason is quite interesting because Howard is able to persuade major Black organizations throughout the United States to put their money in a bank. He's one of the directors of the bank in Memphis, a Black bank called Tri-State. And then if people were victims of economic pressure in rural Mississippi, they could go to Tri-State to get a business loan on normal economic terms if they were denied a loan by the local bank. So this is all his idea to break this boycott, and successfully, I think, to a great extent, of civil rights figures. But it's tremendous pressure. I mean, they're doing stuff like finding out who's petitioning for school integration in Mississippi, getting lists, publishing them in the newspaper, and then pressure is put on people. You about cancel culture. It's like severe cancel culture against civil rights activists in that context.
Yeah, certainly. Jason Riley has sort of defined this as the great, I don't know if you'd call it a dialect, but the division in people's vision of how individuals or groups become successful. One is the capital theory, which is individuals build up their skill set and acquire property and have more voluntary contracts and exchanges, and that's what makes people wealthier, versus the political theory, which is you first have to get involved into politics. His main examples would be the Japanese Americans or Asian Americans not having great representation in Congress or the presidency, but still having higher incomes than whites. What are some other free market mechanisms that minorities have used throughout the past in order to increase their standard of living and well-being?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that this capital explanation is very important because Booker T. Washington predicted we'd have a Black president someday. And this is like in 1900. People thought he was crazy. But his argument was you build this Black middle class, you buy property, and then you'd be in a position to do civil rights. I could give you, examples of this, like, for example, on transportation. You had segregated bus systems a lot of places. So what African Americans would do is they would set up their own companies or patronize their own companies called jitneys, which have these small buses or even real bus companies. And Martin Luther King did this in a way often forgotten. In the initial stages of the Montgomery bus boycott, you had people not using the bus, and this put tremendous pressure on people. So they set up their own services to transport people to work that needed to go to work. And what did the whites do? They went and said, you're competing illegally with the bus company and with taxi cabs. And they would use the local very progressive licensing laws that used to exist a lot of places. For Uber kind of broke some of that down, where you could only have, the cab company was a monopoly, the bus company was a monopoly, and they would challenge that to these through these jitney services. So that's sort of one example that comes to mind. And there's a rich history. There's a rich history of this of this kind of this kind of activity.
My next question was going to be about licensing, considering if you need to take a long test to vote and the questions are difficult. Well, in 1920, blacks are not going to be able to vote more or less, especially when the test is ridiculously ridiculously hard. When it comes to licensing, though, they assume that, well, all the tests you have to take and all the things you have to qualify for, well, that doesn't hurt anyone. That's just for the public good to keep us all safe. Were there any other ways that minorities were able to get around licensing, or examples of licensing making some groups poorer than they otherwise would have been?
Well, you're right about this. A very good book by David Bernstein that looks at licensing, and how licensing could be, could be extremely exclusionary and discriminatory, and how unions, for example, used it. Well, unions might be an example of that in a way, that African Americans would often be frozen out of certain trades because of union pressure, and would work as replacement workers. And some of these guys really meant business. There's a story about some of these replacement workers that, sometimes called scabs, that would be tough, really tough people. And they would go into these communities, and they'd be predominantly African American, and they'd, go in these armed caravans, and if people attacked them, they'd fight back, and that kind of thing. So yeah, that happened. You would have ways, for example, there were zoning laws that existed in a lot of places that made it very difficult, sometimes made it illegal for Black people to purchase property from white people. This was true in Birmingham. It was true in Louisville, Kentucky. They actually had zone systems. That's how zoning arose, through this kind of system. Well, how would people get around that? They'd find a white friend who would buy the property for them, and so forth. So you see some innovative ways that people would get around this, as loopholes in voting. For example, in some places, African Americans could vote if they had a white sponsor. And in the Tuskegee area, they're actually able to get like a third of the votes by 1950 through this sponsorship system of going to whites and getting them to sponsor them. And whites got so worried, white political leaders, that they abolished the town of Tuskegee. They abolished it and had it taken over by the county as a way to counteract that. I'm of the opinion that segregation, Jim Crow, would have broken down a lot earlier if government had been much more localized. For example, in Little Rock, the school board there was perfectly willing to integrate the schools. It was the state that stepped in. You see the examples like that occurring elsewhere. So I think if government had been more localized, the states in some sense were too big, you might have made some inroads a lot quicker, because urban areas, certain areas tended to be a lot more tolerant, but then they'd crack, the more rural areas would sort of crack down on them when they showed any weakness.
At the time, how were politicians sort of justifying to the public this blatant double standards? We have these rules for this group of citizens and totally different rules for this set. What was the propaganda used to sell such a scam?
Well, on schools, it was sort of, it was one race is superior to the other, but also if you have the races mix, this will produce a product, a mixed group that will be inferior to both. That was sort of one of the arguments they would make. A lot of these are rationalizations, but they would say, look, we can't have Black and white children going to school. It really comes down to sex, really, because if they go to school together, the little girls and little boys will start being friends, and they'll date, and it'll break down these barriers. You'll have pressure for intermarriage. I mean, that was a key argument. That's why there's an argument to be made that a mistake was made in not going after the denial of voting rights first and waiting to go after school segregation later, because it is much more difficult to defend, if you claim to be some fair-minded person, the denial of voting rights for African Americans than school segregation, because they could say, well, maybe we need to give more money to the black schools. They'll get a good education. They can go do all the stuff. They can make that argument. Defending the denial of voting rights is more difficult. However, that was where the emphasis was first in the 1950s, was schools. It got all these groups all hot and bothered, and they're mobilized. And so when voting rights comes up, they see that as tied together. And you see some interesting movements in the early 50s in Mississippi, elsewhere, including Howard, to register a lot of quietly, a lot of African Americans. And maybe if the legal pressure had been there first, you might have had more success. But that's the kind of arguments they make. They don't want to talk about denial of voting rights, though. It's interesting if you look at newspapers from 1954 in Mississippi, they don't want to talk about that because it's harder for them to come up with an argument for it.
When it comes to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he is constantly put at the top of best presidents ever lists. But, there's been a great revision about the New Deal in prolonging the Depression, a popular study out of UCLA, along with people like Bert Folsom. You have taken an interest in the attack on civil liberties by the Roosevelt administration. What do we need to know about Franklin Roosevelt's attack on civil liberties from 1933 until his passing in the mid-40s?
Oh boy. Well, I have a book coming out next year, and it's been slowed down. It's Independent Institute, and unfortunately David Thoreau passed away, so things are a little bit slowed up there, but it still should come out next year, and it's going to be called FDR's War on the Bill of Rights, Mass Surveillance, I forget, Free Speech, and Concentration Camps. And so FDR, the argument has been made about the New Deal by Bert Folsom and others being a disaster in terms of getting the U.S. out of the Depression. I think that's a very strong argument. My approach was to look at the civil rights issues, and there are some interesting things going on. One of them is something called the Black Committee, which was called that because it was the senator from Alabama named Hugo Black, later Supreme Court Justice, headed this Senate committee. And they did this very inquisitorial investigation of anti-New Deal groups. And one of the ways they did it was he wanted to blindside these witnesses. And so what better way to blindside somebody today, for example, would be to get copies of their emails or their texts and say, well, on June 8th, you wrote this, right? Many of us would find that very difficult to deal with that. And it's out of the blue. And so what Black did is he had a really smart idea. He says, and there's a long story here, but basically he went to the FCC, which with the cooperation of the Roosevelt administration agreed to this. And the FCC had a law at the time. Well, it was a federal law that went back before the FCC, but it said that the telegraph companies, Western Union, places like that, had to have copies of their telegrams, had to keep copies of all their telegrams. And so he thought, well, I could get access to the copies of these telegrams. And that's the email of its day, right? Immediate communication. Businesses use it. Political groups use it. It is, more important than telephone, or as important, certainly, as a mode of communication. So he goes and goes to the FCC, and they fight, and the company fights him. But the FCC basically orders Western Union and the other telegraph companies to provide access to these telegrams, to the copies of the originals. And so what he does is he subpoenas all the telegrams sent in and out of Washington, D.C. for a full year. And then he expands it. And he gets a list of hundreds of people. He says, I want all the telegrams of this person in and out. How many does he get? Millions. Something like 2 million, 3 million telegrams. Amazing. And he sends his staffers in, they go through these telegrams, and they try to get as much dirt as they can, and they try to blindside these witnesses. This, fortunately, is stopped after some time, after he's able to do this, to amass these telegrams. by a federal court, which says you can't do this anymore, and it's a really good precedent. And that is mass surveillance. And of course, we could give examples of free speech and free assembly, often done by local pro-New Deal leaders, often against African American Republicans in Memphis, for example, or other places where they in Jersey City, where these local mayors would just simply deny freedom of assembly to anyone that disagreed with them, would use building codes, would use government regulations to shut down meeting halls. This is going on all over the place. And the Roosevelt administration is basically, these are their allies and they're complicit with it. And of course, worst of all, and I've actually seen some people try to put a smiley face on this lately, was internment of Japanese American citizens, which is indefensible on so many different grounds. But this is the worst violation of the civil rights of American citizens. One could have debates about the American Indians, who were not citizens, interestingly enough, at the time. Violation of the civil rights of American citizens, the constitutional rights ever in American history. And they're throwing them in concentration camps. And later, of course, we use the term internment camps, but Roosevelt's own terminology was concentration camps. And I'm not saying that they're the same as the death camps that Hitler used. I'm not making that argument, but they were concentration camps. They had guard towers. People were shot for trying to escape. You were forced to go there. You had no choice. It was a great stain in Roosevelt's responsibility. I think historians try to excuse him by saying it was the military, but Roosevelt pushed for it. And there were a lot of people in his administration that were against this, including his own attorney general, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Secretary of the Interior. I could give you a long list of people in the Roosevelt administration that were always against doing this. Now, they ended up going along with it, but they said, don't do this. And he did it anyway. Roosevelt pushed this. And I think if you look at history texts, there's not enough willingness to blame him and blame him directly for initiating this. We talk about Roosevelt's tremendous charisma, and he had it. There was a crucial period after Pearl Harbor where he could have come forward and defended Japanese Americans, as patriotic as he didn't. He's just silent, and he let all this racism fester, and really created a dangerous situation. Then he steps in and approves internment of Japanese Americans. I just don't think there's any excuse for it, but I think it fits Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not a civil libertarian. He had no real interest in it. His own attorney general, who was a civil libertarian of sorts, said so. Robert Jackson, Supreme Court Justice appointed Roosevelt, said, look, the man was, basically Roosevelt's view was, we have an end we want. We're not going to worry about due process and constitutional procedure if we have to achieve that end. And I've got testimony from all sorts of Roosevelt insiders that that's what his mentality was, right? Civil liberties was not his priority at all. In fact, his view was override them if you have to and do it. But he's very smart about it. He's very good about it, about keeping him some distance, but really as the kind of puppet master, behind the scenes. But unlike Trump, he'll just barrel right in there, take responsibility. Roosevelt doesn't. Very careful about that. Very careful. Very devious.
Certainly. In the New Deal era, there were some states that got no food aid relief. And this is sort of the ultimate justification for the Roosevelt era, that, look, when it really counted, Roosevelt got food to people who would have gone hungry. Have you found a large discrepancy in number of people who starved to death or drastic decreases in standard of living from the states that got no aid, of which Folsom says that there are a great number, versus the states that did get a lot of aid?
I have not looked at that particular issue, but you're right about Folsom. I would recommend to everyone who's listening to read Folsom's book, New Deal,
Or raw
Raw Deal
deal?
and New Deal, Raw Deal. It's really good. But he looks at this, and this was sort of known at the time, that in the 1936 election, which Roosevelt won in a landslide, Folsom thinks a good part of that election victory, in fact, he thinks maybe he got the election that way. I don't know if I go that far, but was explained by Roosevelt's strategic use of New Deal dollars, New Deal aid. And what he did was very, very smart from a political standpoint, very cynical. He had states that he had a lock on. Alabama would be one. The whole South he had a lock on. He had a lock on other states. And so he would target these states that were more swing states. And he would pour resources into there to just give people money, to buy people off. And you even have stories of people calling the WPA, and people would answer the phone and they'd say Democratic headquarters. You had this interactive relationship. Interestingly enough, switching the topic a little bit, I found on Japanese internment, a lot of people ask them, what was the number one government agency in terms of money spent for Japanese internment in 1942? What government agency spent more on that than any other? Any guesses?
Workers Project Administration,
Exactly. You
Progress?
got
Yeah.
it. You got it. WPA, before it was shut down at the end of 42, partly because they wanted to run the whole thing they wanted to keep running it. They pushed for it. So a lot of the guard towers, a lot of the camps themselves, the personnel for these camps are WPA people. And the WPA quite rapidly saw an opportunity and got involved in the internment early on and really wanted to run the whole thing. But they ended up shutting them down because WPA was unpopular in Congress, and they created this new thing called the War Relocation Agency. But basically, those people had been WPA people, a lot of them. So it's very interesting. Shows a connection between the welfare state and the concentration camp state, I guess you could say, in the war.
How did Roosevelt sell? I get that conscription is forced labor, so it's not like you necessarily need to rally up volunteers, but always you need to sell people on public opinion. How did Roosevelt sell conscription after the First World War was now seen as so unpopular?
All right. He got Republican support. That helped him a little bit. Like he got in 1940, this complete outsider came in and got the Republican nomination, Wendell Willkie, a little bit shades of Trump in a way. And Willkie was very sympathetic to Roosevelt's agenda on foreign policy. So that meant that there was sort of the Republicans really, there was an element of the party that was, since World War One, had been pro-national security and so forth. And so forth. But you have a lot of things happening that create a sense of urgency. I think you could look at what happened in Ukraine, Ukraine a few months ago, where all this stuff was happening that really put non-interventionists on the defensive. One of them was the fall of France, right? That occurs. So you're getting this, Hitler is expanding. He's moving forward. But as it is, I believe conscription was approved by a single vote. So Roosevelt has a Democratic Congress. He has some Republican vote. He has to fight for it. So he gets it by a single vote, which is, never been that close before or since, right? We haven't had a straight up vote on conscription really since then. How is he able to sell it? I think he's just able to say, they're making the argument. It's sort of like the old militia, right? We're just going to have this in reserve, right? We don't want rich people getting out of this, that kind of thing. So class argument that they're making. But yeah, that's an interesting question. But I think they're making those sorts of arguments that are familiar, that you would hear now.
In 1947, George Morgenstern wrote a book titled, I think it's Pearl Harbor and the Secret War, and he quotes Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War at the time, saying that we did everything we could to provoke Japan into making the first move. The New York Times in 1972 publishes Churchill's 950 volumes from the British cabinet paper saying that Roosevelt in August of 1940 was talking to Churchill in Canada saying we're doing everything we can to force an incident. Churchill says Roosevelt was sure that the Americans should come in on our side. Do you think FDR intentionally provoked Pearl Harbor in order to expand government in the foreign case as he was already doing domestically?
I think Roosevelt was happy that the attack had occurred. He was relieved. I think that, yes, they are pushing as hard as they can to get some sort of incident, to get something happening. Now, a lot of the focus is on the North Atlantic, but there's an old argument here that I think there's merit to called backdoor to war, that maybe the emphasis wasn't on the Far East, but if you're going in the Far East, you're likely to go in, because of the Axis agreement and so forth. You're going to end up getting involved in a European war. So did he know specifically attack was coming on Pearl Harbor? I think, that's a big debate. Did he try to provoke an attack? Did he want us to get in? Roosevelt says, I think it's a month before Pearl Harbor, he tells the British basically that if the Japanese attack your British possessions in Asia, we're going to come in. Now, he could say that. He did say that. That's not disputed. But could he have brought us in? That would have been a fight, right? He would have had to get Congress to agree to that. But he's certainly putting Americans in jeopardy. He's, you've got the boycott of Japanese goods. So I think that there's a very strong argument there. And I don't think it's particularly controversial that he wanted the Japanese, he wanted some sort of incident, he wanted to get into war with Japan. He certainly wants that in the North Atlantic as well. He's very much trying to provoke the Germans into an incident in the North Atlantic and inventing all sorts of things, right? Trying to ramp up the importance of particular incidents that are occurring.
One
like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. He's doing that kind of thing all over the place, right?
One final note on FDR. Is it true that he appointed a Klansman to be in the Supreme Court, Hugo Black?
Well, the Klansman was Hugo Black, the same senator.
That was the guy, okay.
Who chaired the Black Committee. And Black was a very loyal New Dealer. He was a populist. He was beloved by many liberals. He was a progressive, and he was a fighter. He was ruthless. He was Joe McCarthy of the 1930s, but he had charm and he had some subtlety and grace to him. But he was basically used those kinds of tactics. Now, why did Black get appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court? Well, a vacancy came up. This is not too long after the Black Committee had its heyday. And Roosevelt, it was a reward. The best evidence I've seen is the reason Black was appointed in the first place is because he had done loyal service as head of the Black Committee. I don't think that's a very controversial argument to make. Now, it was rumored that he was in the Klan, that and then after the appointment, these rumors exploded. And a newspaper called the Chicago Tribune, a very anti-New Deal paper, had a picture of Hugo Black as a night rider stealing telegrams. And it was obviously saying this guy's a Klansman and here's what he's doing here. So the link was made. Now, after it came out, Black gives this mealy-mouthed justification like I had to do it when I was there to get elected, and trying to to derationalize it. Roosevelt was brought up to Roosevelt, and he said to Black personally, I think this is in Black's papers. He said, look, a lot of my best friends are in the Ku Klux Klan. I don't see why everyone is making such a big deal about it. Roosevelt stuck behind Black once these revelations really exploded after Black had been nominated, because he really didn't care about it. And really it was mainly on the political right, conservatives, that were outraged by this. But Black was able to kind of finesse it, explain it away, and get in. So it didn't matter to Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt's fine with that. Okay, you're a Klansman, big deal, right? He even said they're a social organization, making that kind of argument.
Two more questions for you, Dr. Beito. Thank you so much for your time. You wrote a book, From Mutual Aid to Welfare State, Fraternal Societies and Social Services, 1890 to 1867. What are the biggest... I'm sorry, 1967. Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I didn't go backwards. What are some of the biggest lessons you learned when you were researching mutual aid societies and these fraternal organizations?
Well, if you read American history books, these are invisible. And we get private charity, and it said, oh, private charity was so small, so few people got it. That was sort of the argument. Well, yeah, very few people got private charity in the traditional top-down charity. Well, you had 40% poverty rates at the turn of the century by any estimate, most estimates. So how did people get by? Why aren't they all dying? In fact, why are they moving forward and going up the ladder and getting better jobs and being prospering? Why don't you have Jews still on the Lower East Side of New York? Why are they moving to the middle class, or Poles? Well, a lot of it is because they had their own networks of mutual aid, social welfare that would provide business support and other things. But you had fraternal hospitals, you had provision for unemployed, you had health insurance, you had everything the modern welfare state does, to the extent was done by these mutual aid organizations. You had millions of people belonging to them. These were predominantly working class, and no two groups were more likely to belong to fraternal societies than immigrants from Eastern Europe and African Americans. African Americans were more likely to belong to fraternal groups and own insurance of any kind than whites were. And they were all over the place. And that's how I got into the Mississippi topic, because you have these groups that were the single largest groups among African Americans in terms of social organizations, millions of people. I mean, maybe the church had more, but they were interconnected with the churches as well. So they're providing this full gamut of social welfare services. Before the rise of the welfare state, through cooperative insurance, they are not charity organizations, or at least they would say they aren't, because they said, look, our services are, I might get it one day, you might get it the other. They are multi-class organizations. This is one of the reasons historians don't like them. They don't like getting involved in political fights. They don't get involved in labor strikes, by and large. They try to stay out of that kind of conflict, and they try to appeal to Republicans, Democrats, everybody. So they connect people who might have differences, religious differences, political differences. They can come together in these fraternal organizations to provide for local services. They are decentralized in lodge systems.
And what are some of the names of these organizations, specific ones that really stood out to you that you'd recommend people look into so they can get an idea of how these organizations operated?
Oh, it's almost limitless, but you've got groups like the Odd Fellows. That was one of the largest groups. The Masons is the most famous, but groups like the Odd Fellows are more working class, perhaps. You've got groups like the Knights of Pythias, and then one of the groups I looked at in Mississippi, you got African American groups. The group that ran the hospital there that I spoke about earlier was the International Order of 12 Knights and Daughters of Tabor, and they were a predominantly female organization. Interestingly enough, a lot of the Black groups were predominantly female in membership. So you have, even though we have the term fraternal, that would include women who would belong to these groups as well. They didn't use the term sororial to describe them. You had groups, immigrant groups like Polish National Alliance. You have the Japanese would have these groups that would be based on local villages and so forth that people would come from Japan. You had Jews had these groups called Landsmannschaften that would often, they'd be all over, hundreds of these groups would be all over New York, the Lower East Side. And so it was a key part of social life during the early 20th century for the working class. Far more workers belonged to fraternal societies than to unions. Again, that's not even dispute. So what do we have? We have tons of labor history is pretty much ignored this aspect of what workers were actually doing, which is belonging to lodges and providing services.
Yeah, it's really amazing how we've had a drastic increase in healthcare costs since Medicare, Medicaid, FDA expansion, since the Affordable Care Act, Medicare Part D under George Bush, and people just don't seem to appreciate the influence of fraternal organizations
You're
at
tying people
their
more
time.
to the state and to their jobs through the tax code.
Mm,
That has been the trend for decades. These groups are, they're not geographically based. They might have members all over the country. You can transfer your benefits, and they're side to side. They're workers taking care of, or people taking care of peers. They're not employer provision, and they're not certainly government provision. They're not top down. They're reciprocal,
wow.
much more reciprocal, at least.
When you studied history, what are the main lessons you've learned when it comes to how public opinion can be changed?
Oh, I wish I knew that. How can public opinion be changed? I wish I could answer your question, to be honest with you. Um, I'm not so sure public opinion is necessarily the driver we make it out to be. Maybe I could answer it that way. For example, in 1932, when Roosevelt was elected president, he did not run on a New Deal agenda. In fact, some of his speeches sound like, I don't know, more radical than Ronald Reagan, calling for budget cuts and criticizing the Hoover administration and so forth, defending the gold standard, all these things. And but you had a desperate situation in 1932 when he was elected. You had a sense of emergency. You had a sense of high unemployment. And so Roosevelt is able to manipulate that rally effect around the president to push this New Deal agenda. However, if Roosevelt had used his great charisma to push for a more classical liberal agenda, I think he could have gotten just about anything he wanted. So I think sometimes we see public opinion, if we look at, say, the welfare state, this is all comes from public opinion. I think a lot of this stuff is being manipulated from above, taking advantage of I don't know how to really answer your question, except I think we need more work on examples throughout history, for example, of how people are able to provide to these services on their own, and that can maybe filter down, because if you get any newspaper, you can find politicians of both parties are using historical examples for particular agendas. It's not a very strong answer, perhaps, but I think but that's one way to change public opinion, is to study the market and look at the effects of the market and get that out there. Have an answer for those who say, oh, the market failed to do this and that, to provide education and so forth. Well, maybe so, but maybe what you'll find is that there is a rich story there that hasn't been told yet.
Thanks to everyone for watching Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Dr. David Beito, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you so much. You're doing great work at the Institute. And I'm a big fan of Scott Horton. And now I'm a fan of this show, which I'm going to start listening to.